October 22nd, 1962. Holy Loch, Scotland. 300 yards off the port bow of USS Proteus. The smell of diesel exhaust and salt water hung thick in the cold Scottish air as USS Abraham Lincoln sat alongside the tender, hull number 602, visible in white paint against her black pressure hull. Commander Leonard Erb stood on the bridge in his foul-weather jacket, watching work crews disconnect shore power cables and hydraulic lines with a speed that looked close to panic. Below him, in the missile compartment, 16 Polaris A-2 ballistic missiles sat vertical in their tubes, each carrying a W-47 thermonuclear warhead with a yield of 1.2 megatons. Each warhead could vaporize a Soviet city: Moscow, Leningrad, Murmansk. The target folders were already loaded into the fire control system. 4 days earlier, the Abraham Lincoln had been scheduled for a routine 4-week upkeep period. The Blue crew had been looking forward to it. Shore leave in Scotland, letters from home, hot showers that lasted longer than 90 seconds, sleep in a bed that didn't rock with the North Atlantic swells. Commander Erb had planned to take 3 days in Edinburgh with his wife, who had flown over from Connecticut. Then President Kennedy went on television. The work crews on the Abraham Lincoln had watched the broadcast in the crew's mess, crowded around a small black and white television someone had brought aboard from Proteus. Kennedy's voice was steady, but his message was not. Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles. Cuba. 90 miles from Florida. Nuclear warheads. A naval quarantine. The United States Navy would intercept any Soviet ships carrying offensive weapons to Cuba. Kennedy called it a quarantine because calling it a blockade would have been an act of war. The crew knew what it meant. The Soviet Union would not accept this. Khrushchev could not accept this. And when 2 nuclear superpowers refused to back down, submarines like the Abraham Lincoln stopped being a deterrent and start being a first strike weapon. Commander Erb received the flash message from Sublant at 0400 hours on October 23rd. Emergency deployment. Immediate departure. No time frame for return. The upkeep period was over. The crew had been given 6 hours to recall every man from shore leave, complete emergency provisioning, and get the boat underway. 6 hours to prepare for what might be the last patrol any of them would ever make. If you are enjoying this investigation into history's hidden conflicts, please subscribe to the channel Cold War Chronicles. We declassify the past to understand the present. The Abraham Lincoln was an Ethan Allen-class fleet ballistic missile submarine, the first class designed from the keel up to carry the Polaris missile system. She was 381 feet long, 33 feet in beam, and displaced 7,800 tons submerged. Her S-5W pressurized water reactor could push her to 22 knots underwater, and her inertial navigation system could keep her on station within a few hundred yards of her designated patrol box for months at a time. She had 4 21-inch torpedo tubes forward, loaded with Mark 37 anti-submarine torpedoes, but those were defensive weapons. Her real armament was in the missile compartment amidships: 16 vertical launch tubes, each 30 feet tall, each containing a Polaris A-2 with a range of 1,700 miles. That range mattered now more than it ever had. If the Abraham Lincoln could position herself in the Norwegian Sea or the North Atlantic, every major Soviet city west of the Urals would be within her firing envelope. The Soviets knew this. Soviet intelligence tracked every American ballistic missile submarine that left Holy Loch, and Soviet attack submarines, Novembers and Foxtrots, prowled the approaches to the base, waiting to pick up the acoustic signature of an SSBN making her run to deep water. Commander Erb had studied the Soviet order of battle. He knew that in October 1962, the Soviet Northern Fleet had at least 8 attack submarines operating in the Norwegian Sea and the waters around Iceland. Some were diesel boats, loud and relatively easy to detect. But some were nuclear boats, and those were a different problem. A November-class attack submarine could match the Abraham Lincoln's speed and could stay submerged as long as her reactor kept running. If a November picked up the Lincoln's trail during her transit from Holy Loch to her patrol station, Erb would have to shake it. And shaking a Soviet attack submarine meant going deep, going quiet, and hoping the other captain made a mistake before you did. The last mooring line splashed into the water at 0930 hours. The Abraham Lincoln's single screw began to turn, and the submarine eased away from USS Proteus. On the bridge, Erb felt the deck shift beneath his boots as the boat gathered way. The Scottish coast slid past to starboard. Green hills, grey stone houses, fishing boats tied up at wooden piers. Dunoon looked peaceful. The people walking along the waterfront had no idea what was about to happen. Maybe they would never know. Maybe Kennedy and Khrushchev would find a way to step back from the edge, and the Abraham Lincoln would complete her patrol and return to Holy Loch in 60 days. And the crew would joke about the time they thought the world was going to end. But Commander Erb did not believe that. He had read the intelligence briefs. He had seen the reconnaissance photos of the Soviet missile sites in Cuba. He knew that in the time it would take the Abraham Lincoln to reach her patrol station, the United States and the Soviet Union could already be at war. And if that happened, the Abraham Lincoln would receive an emergency action message over the VLF radio, and Erb would open the sealed authentication envelope in the captain's safe, and if the codes matched, he would spin up the fire control system and prepare to launch 16 Polaris missiles at pre-designated targets in the Soviet Union. The thought of it made him cold in a way that had nothing to do with the Scottish weather. At 1000 hours, the Abraham Lincoln cleared the anti-submarine boom at the mouth of Holy Loch and entered the Firth of Clyde. The water deepened. Erb ordered the boat rigged for dive. Below, in the control room, the diving officer began the pre-dive checklist. Ballast tank vents, hydraulic systems, atmospheric controls. The ventilation blowers shut down, and the boat went quiet, except for the hum of electrical systems and the soft rush of water along the hull. At 10:30 hours, with the Scottish coast 5 miles astern and the depth under the keel at 400 feet, Commander Erb gave the order. Dive the boat, make your depth 200 feet. Course 045, standard bell. The klaxon sounded twice. The lookouts dropped through the bridge hatch. Erb followed them down, dogging the hatch behind him. The vents opened. Seawater flooded into the ballast tanks. The deck tilted forward, and the Abraham Lincoln slipped beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. She would not surface again for 65 days. In the control room, the plainsman held the bow planes at a 10-degree down angle, watching the depth gauge as the numbers climbed. 100 feet, 150, 200. The diving officer called out, "Level at 200 feet, trim satisfactory." The helmsman steadied the rudder on course 045, northeast, toward the Norwegian Sea, toward the patrol station designated in the operations order, toward the Soviet Union. Commander Erb stood behind the periscope stand, hands on the railing, watching his crew work. They were good. They had trained for this. Every man aboard the Abraham Lincoln knew his job, knew the procedures, knew what was expected of him. But training for deterrence patrols and training for war are not the same thing. Deterrence patrols are built on the assumption that you will never have to launch your missiles. War patrols are built on the assumption that you will. The Radio Shack was already monitoring the VLF frequency. Very low-frequency radio was the only way to communicate with a submerged submarine, and even that required the boat to come shallow, within 60 feet of the surface, to trail a long wire antenna. The VLF signal was slow, maddeningly slow, transmitting at a rate of a few words per minute. But it was the only link between the Abraham Lincoln and the National Command Authority. If Kennedy decided to launch, the order would come over VLF, and if the Soviets decided to attack, the order to retaliate would come the same way, or it would not come at all. That was the nightmare scenario. If the Soviets launched a decapitation strike, nuclear weapons targeted at Washington, at NORAD, at Strategic Air Command headquarters, there might not be anyone left to send the launch order. The Abraham Lincoln could be alone, cut off, with no way to know if the United States still existed. and the standing orders were clear. If communication could not be re-established within a specified time frame, the submarine commander was authorized to launch on his own authority. Erb had never told his crew about that. He did not need to. They knew. Every officer aboard knew. The fire control technicians knew. The missile techs knew. If the radio went silent for too long, Commander Leonard Erb would have to decide whether to end the world. At 1100 hours, the Abraham Lincoln crossed the 100-fathom curve and entered deep water. Erb ordered the boat to 300 feet. The hull creaked as the pressure increased. In the engine room, the S5W reactor ran smooth and steady, heating the primary coolant loop, driving the steam turbines, turning the single screw. The Abraham Lincoln was making 18 knots, a compromise between speed and stealth. Fast enough to reach the patrol station within 72 hours, slow enough to keep the flow noise down and avoid cavitation on the screw blades. The sonar operator sat in the darkened sonar shack, headphones clamped over his ears, eyes on the waterfall display. The green lines scrolled down the screen, painting a picture of the ocean in sound. Biologics, whales, dolphins, schools of fish. Merchant traffic on the surface, freighters and tankers making their way through the North Atlantic shipping lanes. And somewhere out there, Soviet submarines. Listening. Waiting. At 1300 hours, the sonar operator called it out. Con, sonar, new contact, designate Sierra 1, bearing 270, range estimate 12,000 yards, classify possible submarine, diesel signature. Erb felt his pulse quicken. Sonar, con, can you confirm classification? Con, sonar, confirmed diesel submarine. Hearing blade rate consistent with Soviet Foxtrot class. Contact is snorkeling. Bearing is steady. Range is opening. A Foxtrot. A Soviet diesel attack submarine, probably out of Murmansk, probably running a patrol line along the approaches to Holy Loch. The Foxtrot was snorkeling, running her diesel engines to charge her batteries, which meant she was not trying to hide. She was making noise, advertising her presence, daring any American submarine in the area to reveal itself. Erb did not take the bait. Helm, steady as she goes. Maintain course and speed. The Abraham Lincoln continued northeast, opening the range to the Soviet submarine. The Foxtrot sonar would hear nothing. At 300 feet, below the thermocline, the Abraham Lincoln was acoustically invisible. But for how long? The Abraham Lincoln maintained her northeast course for 3 days. 3 days of silent running. 3 days of monitoring the VLF frequency, 3 days of watching the crew's faces grow tighter as the news filtered down through the boat. Kennedy had addressed the United Nations. Khrushchev had sent a letter. U Thant was trying to negotiate. Soviet ships were still steaming toward Cuba. American destroyers were positioned along the quarantine line. Someone was going to blink. The question was who? Commander Erb spent most of his time in the control room, or in his tiny cabin, reading and rereading the patrol orders, the authentication procedures, the target packages. The target packages were the worst. Each one was a manila folder with a Soviet city's name printed on the tab. Inside were coordinates, aiming points, expected blast radius, estimated casualties. Erb had opened one folder, Leningrad, and then closed it and put it back in the safe. He did not need to know how many people would die. He just needed to know that if the order came, he would turn the key. On October 25th, at 0200 hours, the Abraham Lincoln crossed into her assigned patrol box. The Norwegian Sea, 600 miles from the North Cape, water depth 1400 fathoms. Cold, dark, empty. Erb ordered the boat to 400 feet and reduced speed to 5 knots. At 5 knots, the Abraham Lincoln was almost silent. The reactor coolant pumps ran on natural circulation. The screw turned slowly enough to avoid cavitation. The only sounds were the subtle creaks of the hull under pressure and the soft whisper of water flowing past the hydrophones. This was deterrence. This was what the boat had been built for. To sit in the deep ocean, invisible, invulnerable, waiting. The Soviets knew there were American ballistic missile submarines somewhere in the North Atlantic and the Norwegian Sea. They knew those submarines carried enough firepower to obliterate every major city in the Soviet Union. They knew they could not find them, and that knowledge, that uncertainty, was supposed to keep them from starting a war. But what if the war had already started? On October 26th, the VLF antenna picked up a transmission. The radio operator decoded it and brought the message to the control room on a clipboard. Commander Erb read it twice. Soviet ships approaching quarantine line. USS Joseph P. Kennedy making intercept. Tensions high. No shots fired. Maintain readiness posture. Maintain readiness posture. That meant keep the missiles spun up. Keep the fire control system online. Keep the authentication safe sealed. Keep waiting. The crew was starting to crack. Not visibly. Not in a way that would show up in the watch logs. But Erb could see it. The sonar operator's hands shook when he adjusted the gain on the passive array. The missile techs triple-checked their pre-launch procedures when they should have been sleeping. The cooks in the galley burned the coffee and forgot to start the bread dough. Men who had been friends for 2 years stopped talking to each other. The air in the boat felt thick, oppressive, like the pressure outside the hull had somehow leaked inside. On October 27th, everything changed. The VLF transmission came in at 1400 hours. Erb was in his cabin, trying to sleep and failing. The radio man knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. His face was pale. He handed Erb the decoded message and stepped back. Erb read it, then he read it again. Then he stood up and walked to the control room, the message still in his hand. Officer of the deck, come to periscope depth, rig for VLF reception. I need confirmation on this traffic. The diving officer looked at him. Sir, we're in the patrol box. Protocol says. I know what protocol says. Come to periscope depth. Now. The deck tilted up. The depth gauge unwound. 400 feet. 300. 200. 100. 60 feet. The periscope broke the surface. Erb did not raise it. He did not need to see the sky. He needed to hear from sublant. He needed to know if the message was real. The VLF antenna trailed behind the boat, a long wire floating just below the surface. The radio receiver locked onto the signal. Another transmission came through. The radio man decoded it and handed it to Erb. Confirmed. Soviet SA-2 missile battery shot down USAF U-2 over Cuba. Pilot Major Rudolf Anderson killed. DEFCON 2 remains in effect. Soviet ships continue approach to quarantine line. Maintain readiness posture. Do not acknowledge this transmission. Erb felt something cold settle into his chest. An American pilot was dead. The Soviets had fired first. Not at a ship, not at a ground target. At an aircraft in international airspace. Kennedy would have to respond. He could not let this go unanswered. And if Kennedy responded, Khrushchev would respond to that. And then, diving officer, take us back down, make your depth 400 feet, rig for silent running. The boat nosed over and slipped back into the dark. Erb stood at the periscope stand, the message still in his hand, and tried to calculate how much time they had left. Hours, days. Would the next VLF transmission be the emergency action message? Would he hear the authentication codes and know that Washington had been hit, that New York was gone, that the United States was dying and taking the Soviet Union with it? He looked around the control room. 20 men at their stations, another 120 scattered through the boat, all of them waiting, all of them trusting him to make the right decision when the time came. What if there was no right decision? On October 28th, the VLF transmission came at 0600 hours. Erb was already awake. He had not slept in 36 hours. The radio man brought the message to his cabin. Erb opened it. Soviet ships turning back from quarantine line. Khrushchev agrees to remove missiles from Cuba in exchange for US guarantee not to invade and removal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Crisis appears to be de-escalating. Maintain readiness posture until further notice. Erb read the message 3 times. Then he folded it, put it in his pocket, and walked to the control room. The officer of the deck looked at him. "New orders, sir." "Negative. Maintain current patrol station. Maintain readiness posture." Because it was not over. Not yet. Khrushchev had agreed to remove the missiles, but they were not gone. The Soviet ships had turned back, but they could turn around again. Kennedy had promised not to invade Cuba, but promises could be broken. The crisis was de-escalating, but de-escalation is not the same thing as resolution. The Abraham Lincoln stayed on station. Days turned into weeks. The crew stopped asking when they would go home. VLF transmissions came and went, updates on the Soviet missile withdrawal, reports of UN inspectors in Cuba, assurances that the crisis was over. But the patrol orders did not change. Maintain readiness posture. Stay on station. Keep the missiles ready. Erb watched his crew age. Men who had been 30 looked 40. Men who had been enthusiastic looked hollow. The boat smelled like sweat and oil and recycled air. The food started to run low. Fresh vegetables were gone by the 3rd week. Meat was gone by the 5th. They were eating canned beans and powdered eggs and bread that tasted like cardboard. On November 15th, the sonar operator detected another contact. Con, sonar, new contact, designate Sierra 5, bearing 090. Range estimate 8,000 yards. Classify possible submarine. Nuclear signature. A November. A Soviet attack submarine. Probably out of Murmansk. Probably looking for exactly what the Abraham Lincoln was. An American ballistic missile submarine on deterrent patrol. Erb made his decision in 3 seconds. Helm, come right to course 180. Maintain depth. Reduce speed to 3 knots. The Abraham Lincoln turned south, away from the contact, slowing to a crawl. At 3 knots, she was a hole in the water. The November's sonar would hear nothing but ocean. Sonar con, report contact status. Con, sonar. Contact bearing is steady. Range is opening. Contact is not maneuvering to intercept. Assess contact has not detected us. Erb let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. The November continued northeast, hunting for something she would never find. The Abraham Lincoln stayed on station until December 26th. 65 days. 65 days submerged. 65 days of waiting for the order that never came. When the message finally arrived, return to Holy Loch, patrol complete. Erb read it twice to make sure it was real. They surfaced on December 27th, 600 miles off the coast of Scotland. The sky was grey. The sea was rough. The air smelled like salt and freedom. Erb stood on the bridge and looked at his crew as they came up through the hatch, one by one, blinking in the daylight like men returning from the grave. They had not fired their missiles. They had not ended the world. They had done their job, and their job had been to wait. Erb thought about the target folders in the safe. Leningrad, Moscow, Murmansk, cities full of people who did not know how close they had come. Cities that still existed because Kennedy and Khrushchev had stepped back from the edge, because the Abraham Lincoln had stayed hidden, because deterrence had worked, this time. The return transit to Holy Loch took 4 days. 4 days that felt longer than the 65 that had come before. The Abraham Lincoln ran on the surface most of the way, making 20 knots through heavy North Atlantic swells. Commander Erb kept the boat surfaced partly for speed, partly because the crew needed it, needed to see the sky, needed to feel wind on their faces, needed to remember that the world still existed. The watch rotation continued as normal, 4 hours on, 8 hours off. But normal was a word that had lost its meaning somewhere between October 26th and December 27th. The men who stood watch on the bridge did so in silence, staring at the grey horizon, smoking cigarettes down to the filter. The men below deck moved through their routines with mechanical precision, but their eyes were somewhere else, somewhere 65 days away, where they had waited for the order that would end everything. Erb spent the transit writing his patrol report. It was classified, top secret, restricted data, which meant it would go directly to Comsublant and possibly to the Joint Chiefs, possibly to the President himself. The report was supposed to be factual, clinical, a record of positions and speeds and contacts and communications. But how do you write a clinical report about waiting to end the world? He wrote about the emergency departure from Holy Loch. He wrote about the transit to the patrol station, the detection of Soviet submarines, the daily routine of silent running. He wrote about the VLF transmissions, the changing status of the crisis, the decision points. He did not write about the fear. He did not write about the nights he spent staring at the overhead in his cabin, calculating how long it would take for 16 Polaris missiles to reach their targets. He did not write about the moment on October 27th when he had genuinely believed he would have to open the authentication safe. Some things did not belong in patrol reports. On December 30th, the Abraham Lincoln passed through the anti-submarine boom at Holy Loch and entered the anchorage. USS Proteus was waiting, massive and grey against the Scottish hills. The tender's deck was lined with people. Erb could see them through the periscope, dock workers, support personnel and families. The families were there, even though they were not supposed to be. The patrol had been classified. The departure date had been classified. The return date had been classified. But somehow, the families knew. They always knew. Erb brought the boat alongside Proteus at 1300 hours. The deck crew secured the mooring lines. Shore power cables snaked across the gap between the submarine and the tender. The engineering officer shut down the reactor and switched to shore power. The Abraham Lincoln was home. The crew filed off the boat one by one, carrying their sea bags, squinting in the pale December sunlight. Some of them were met by wives and children. Some were met by parents or girlfriends. Some had no one waiting and headed directly for the barracks or the nearest pub. Erb watched them go. These men, who had lived with him in a steel tube 400 feet below the surface, who had trusted him with their lives, who had never asked why they stayed submerged for 65 days when the standard patrol was 60. The debriefing started the next morning. A team from Comsublant flew in from Norfolk. 2 captains, a commander, and a civilian from the Office of Naval Intelligence. They set up in a secure compartment aboard Proteus and interviewed the entire crew one by one. The interviews were classified. The crew was reminded that everything about the patrol, the departure date, the duration, the patrol station, the Soviet contacts, the state of readiness, was top secret and would remain so for the foreseeable future. Do not tell your families where you went. Do not tell them how long you were submerged. Do not tell them what you were carrying. Do not tell them how close we came. Erb's interview lasted 4 hours. The debriefers wanted to know everything, every decision, every contact, every message. They were particularly interested in October 27th, the day the U-2 was shot down, the day Erb had come to periscope depth to confirm the message. They wanted to know what he would have done if the emergency action message had come through, if the authentication codes had matched, if he had been ordered to launch. Erb told them what they wanted to hear. He would have followed his orders. He would have opened the safe, verified the codes, spun up the fire control system, and launched 16 Polaris missiles at pre-designated targets in the Soviet Union. He would have done his duty. He did not tell them about the doubt. He did not tell them about the moment when he had stood in the control room with the message in his hand and wondered if following orders meant ending human civilization. He did not tell them that he had looked at his crew and thought about their families and the families in Leningrad and Moscow and Murmansk, and wondered if deterrence was worth the price of being willing to kill millions. Some things were not meant for debriefing reports either. The Abraham Lincoln remained in Holy Loch for 6 weeks of maintenance and crew rest. The Blue crew was relieved by the Gold crew in late January. Commander Erb stayed aboard long enough to brief the Gold crew's commanding officer, and then he flew home to Connecticut. He had not seen his wife since October 19th. He had not spoken to her except for one brief, censored phone call from Scotland in late December. She met him at the airport in New Haven. They drove home in silence. She did not ask where he had been. She knew better. That night, lying in bed in a house that felt impossibly large, after 65 days in a submarine, Erb tried to sleep. He could not. The bed was too soft. The room was too quiet. He kept listening for the hum of the reactor, the whisper of water along the hull, the soft footsteps of the watchstanders in the passageway outside his cabin. He kept waiting for the radio man to knock on the door with a message from Sublant. He got up and went to the kitchen. His wife found him there at 3 a.m, sitting at the table, drinking coffee, staring at nothing. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The Abraham Lincoln returned to patrol in March 1963, and then again in June, and then again in September. The patrols were routine now. 60 days submerged, surface transit to and from the patrol station, regular VLF traffic, no emergencies. The crew rotated: Blue crew, Gold crew, Blue crew, Gold crew. New men reported aboard. Old men transferred to other boats or left the Navy entirely. The missile techs practiced their pre-launch procedures. The sonar operators tracked Soviet submarines. The cooks burned the coffee. But something had changed. The men who had been aboard during the Cuban Missile Crisis knew what the boat was really for. Not deterrence, not patrol, not training. The boat was for the moment when deterrence failed. The boat was for the day when the president opened the football and sent the launch codes, and someone like Commander Leonard Erb had to decide whether to turn the key. And every man who had been aboard during those 65 days in October and November 1962 knew something else. They knew how close that moment had been. They knew that if Kennedy had waited one more day to announce the quarantine, if Khrushchev had refused to turn the ships around, if the generals in Moscow or Washington had pushed harder for a military solution, the Abraham Lincoln would have received the emergency action message, and Erb would have opened the safe, and the missiles would have launched, and the world would have ended. Erb never spoke about it, not to his wife, not to his crew, not to the other commanding officers he met at submarine force conferences. The patrol was classified, and so were his thoughts about it. But sometimes, late at night, when he could not sleep, he would think about October 27th, 1962. He would think about standing in the control room with the message about the U-2 in his hand. He would think about how close he had been to opening that safe. And he would wonder what he would have done if the next message had contained the authentication codes. He told himself he would have followed orders. He told himself he had been trained for this, prepared for this, selected for this. He told himself that deterrence only worked if submarine commanders were willing to execute their orders without hesitation. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, he was not sure. And that uncertainty terrified him more than the Soviets ever had. The crew of the Abraham Lincoln never received any public recognition for their patrol. There were no medals, no commendations, no newspaper articles. The patrol remained classified for decades. The families never knew where their husbands and fathers and sons had been during those 65 days. They never knew how close they had come to losing everything. In 1981, USS Abraham Lincoln was decommissioned after 20 years of service. She had completed 50 strategic deterrent patrols, more than any other ballistic missile submarine of her generation. She had spent more days submerged than on the surface. She had carried enough nuclear firepower to destroy the Soviet Union several times over. And she had never fired a shot in anger. That was deterrence, not the missiles themselves, but the willingness to use them. The knowledge that somewhere beneath the Atlantic or the Pacific, an American submarine was waiting with her missiles armed and her crew ready. The knowledge that if you struck first, they would strike back. The knowledge that there was no victory in nuclear war, only mutual annihilation. The Abraham Lincoln had been part of that calculation, and for 65 days in the fall of 1962, she had been the closest thing to Armageddon that the world had ever seen. Commander Leonard Erb retired from the Navy in 1975 with the rank of captain. He settled in Connecticut and rarely spoke about his time in submarines. When asked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, he would say that he had been on patrol in the Atlantic. When pressed for details, he would say that it was still classified. In 1997, 35 years after the patrol, some of the details were declassified: the departure date, the patrol duration, the general location of the patrol station. But the target folders remained classified. The authentication procedures remained classified. And what Commander Erb had been thinking when he read that message on October 27, 1962, that remained classified forever. If you found this investigation into the invisible warriors of the Cold War compelling, we need your help to ensure these stories reach more people. Please hit the like button, subscribe to Cold War Chronicles, and turn on notifications so you never miss these declassified histories. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, or if you or a family member served in the silent service during the Cold War. Your stories matter. Your memories matter. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps us share these forgotten chapters with a new generation. You're not just watching history, you're helping preserve it. Thank you for being part of this community. Erb passed away in 2004. His obituary in the New Haven Register mentioned his naval service and his command of USS Abraham Lincoln. It did not mention the Cuban Missile Crisis. It did not mention the 65 days submerged. It did not mention the target folders or the authentication, safe, or the moment when he had stood in the control room and wondered if he would have to end the world. But the men who had served under him knew. The sonar operators and the missile techs and the plainsmen and the cooks, they knew. They had been there. They had lived through those 65 days. They had waited with him for the order that never came. And in 2004, when they heard that their old captain had died, they remembered. They remembered the grey Scottish coast disappearing behind them as the Abraham Lincoln submerged. They remembered the green glow of the sonar displays in the darkened shack. They remembered the taste of powdered eggs and stale bread. They remembered the silence of 400 feet depth, the weight of the ocean pressing down on the hull, the knowledge that somewhere above them the world was deciding whether to live or die. And they remembered Commander Leonard Erb standing at the periscope stand, hands on the railing, watching his crew, carrying the weight of 16 nuclear missiles, and the responsibility of knowing when, or if, to use them. They had trusted him with their lives, and he had brought them home. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. The ballistic missile submarines continued their patrols, but the target folders changed. The threat evolved. Deterrence remained. But for 65 days in 1962, deterrence had been tested in a way it had never been tested before. And it had held. Not because of technology, not because of strategy, but because of men like Commander Leonard Erb and the crew of USS Abraham Lincoln, who had been willing to sit in the dark, 400 feet below the surface, waiting for an order they hoped would never come. They had done their duty, and the world had survived. This time. This is Cold War Chronicles. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the invisible war, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We have only just scratched the surface of the secrets buried beneath the ice. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Commander Erb and the men of USS Abraham Lincoln are not forgotten.